I mentioned in an earlier talk that over the years I kind of developed an interest in physics. And again, I said, as long as I don't have to do any math, I'm fine. And of course, if you know physics, it's all math. And so I keep it very, very simple. I think it was Galileo who once said that math is the language of nature. And I think physics is an attempt to understand nature at the most fundamental level. And so there's a lot of math, and I'm really not very good at math. And I think, too, what sort of caught my interest in physics was if you've been listening to some of my talks, you know I like philosophy. And I particularly like what they call metaphysics. And metaphysics is an attempt to try to understand nature and reality at the most fundamental level. And that's in many ways what physics is. Physics is an attempt to, understand reality at the most basic level. And so my interest in metaphysics, for better or for worse, got me interested in physics. And, what is the ultimate nature of reality? Not how it appears to us, but if you get right down to the German word, the Urstoff, the most basic level, what is it? Well, a while back, I picked up a book, popular book on physics, that was dealing with light. And light is really kind of the central study on physics. Einstein's relativity, particularly basically a special relativity, is light, and what is light, and how does light work? And it was called Catching the Light. It was by a fellow named Arthur Zajonc, Zagonc. And I never really finished the book because I just kind of bogged down in it. As I said, if it's not real simple, I kind of get lost in it. But I read something in this book in the first few pages that utterly fascinated me. And that might have been the first 15% of the book that I read, and it absolutely fascinated me. And what he said was, this guy told about an experiment with light. Now listen carefully, because this is it's very counterintuitive. He had a box, and he built the box in a way that he could fill the box with light. So the box was filled with light, but he did it in a way so none of the light reflected off the sides of the inside of the box. Okay, don't ask me how he did it, but he had the box filled with light, but none of the light reflected off of any of the sides of the box. Okay, so inside the box was light. Light alone. Pure light as light. Not reflecting off the wall, or not reflecting off white snow, or not reflecting off the glass, or not reflecting off the particles in the atmosphere, or smoke, or whatever. It was just pure light as light alone. Now, if you looked inside Arthur Zajonc's box, that's what I've titled the sermon, Zajonc's box. That is, if you looked at the light, pure light alone in the box, what would you see? What does light in and of itself look like? But what do you think? You've got a box, and again, it's not reflecting off the sides, it's just pure light as light alone. Well, you look inside the box, and it's absolute pure darkness. Dark, pure darkness. The darkness of empty space even. But you think, how could that be? I mean, the box was filled with light. Well, much to my astonishment and my surprise, and again, I read this a few years ago, so I was probably in my 50s. I'm 56 now. So it was a long time till I knew this. It turns out that unless reflecting off something, or unless you stare directly into it, light is invisible. Now, I realize that's very counterintuitive. That's just, that doesn't make sense. Yet, but light, as light alone, is invisible. We can't see it. In fact, it can't be seen. Now, he took this experiment a little further. What he did was, in this box, he took a rod. And don't ask me how he did it. I don't know. I don't understand how he did it. And he stuck a rod in the box. So like here's the box, and the rod goes right across the box, just like a rod inside an empty box. And what do you think happened to that rod? What do you think he saw? Well, the rod itself, on the side in which the light was coming into the box, was illuminated. Just that one side of the rod. It looked like, and if you looked at it, it looked like a thin beam of light. Say, here's the rod, and it looked like just this beam of light was just going on one side of the rod. Even though the box was filled with light completely, you would see darkness, and then you would just see this little band of light on one side of the rod. It looked like as if a thin light was shining on the rod, on nothing else in the box at all, just along like a thin beam along the rod, even though the light was everywhere in the box. It would be like sticking a rod filled with water into some tank filled with water, but only one side of the rod got wet. Now, why did this happen? Why was only one part of the rod lit? Because that was the side the light was coming in the box. And that was the part that was illuminated. Only when the light reflected off of something, in this case the rod, did it become visible. Otherwise, the light itself, as pure light, was darkness. Everything else in the box was darkness. The light appeared only when it was reflecting off of something. Now, I remember one time I was going to speak at a college. And before I went, somebody warned me about these kids with these laser lights. And they just told me that there's going to be some smart aleck. They've been having trouble with these kids. It's the kind of thing I probably would have done when I was. And they fire one of those beams at you. And they told me about it. And the thing is, now think about this for a minute. You've seen those before, those little laser lights and so on. Now, just think, if somebody out here was doing that right now, somebody was shining them one on me, unless they shined it right into my eyes. Let's say somebody in the back there. Okay, somebody in the back there was fine. Say one of these kids over here. You look like a troublemaker there. I'm just teasing you. Let's say you were firing that light into my eyes right now. Any of you looking, You wouldn't see it, would you? Would you see the light coming? No, I would see it if it was shining right in my eyes. Yet you got a beam of light coming right across. And yet it's completely invisible. Now, if you happen to stick something in front of it, then voila, all of a sudden, that light would appear. If you stuck a rod or something right in the path of the beam, suddenly the light, which is coming in a beam right at me, you would see it. But again, it's because the light itself is invisible. The beam could be hurling across the room, it could be there, but because it wasn't reflecting off of anything, you don't see it. You know it's there only when it is reflecting off of something. Or if you happen to be the unfortunate speaker and the beam was going right into your eyes. Again, you don't generally think about it that way. I mean, it just blew my mind when I heard this. Let me give you one final proof of this. On Earth, sunlight pours down on the sky. And depending on the time of day or where you live and what the atmospheric conditions are, the sky is blue, or it's gray, or it's red, depending on the weather and so on and so forth. I mean, it's what we call sunrise and sunsets. And it depends on the time of day, it depends on the humidity, it depends, where the sun is in the sky, and so on and so forth. It all in the atmosphere, and it all depends on all those conditions. You get the various colors, sunrise, sunsets, middle of the day, and so on. You look up, cloudless sky, clear blue sky. Now, remember the picture of the folks walking on the moon, pure bright in the sun. I mean, their suits were these white suits, blistering light, and the surface of the moon was illuminated, and there you could see the American flag in its red, white, and blue. So you see that on the surface. But if you looked up, if you saw the pictures above, was there a blue sky on the moon? Was there at the sunrise or the sunset on the moon? Did you have any of the colors, any of the light shows that we have every day here on earth? If you looked up, you would see what you'd see in Zajonc's box. With the exception of the stars, way off in the distance, what do you see? It's pure, utter darkness. Even though it's flooded with light, doesn't matter, it's flooded with light. The sun is shining there. And there's light everywhere. But when you look up and stare, just as the light, without it reflecting off of anything, it's pure darkness. Because the moon has no atmosphere. It has no moisture, no gases, none of the fumes, none of that stuff that we have here reflecting sunlight turns it into all those colors that we see over our heads. And thus, because it had nothing to reflect off of, the light was invisible. You see nothing but the distant stars or the earth, all of which are floating in pure darkness. I mean, it looks like it's pure darkness, and yet it's filled with sunlight, depending on the time of the day. Well, the sunlight, it doesn't matter. Actually, it doesn't even matter which way. If you're looking out at in space, whether it's in the morning or the evening, you're looking out. at night, and you're just seeing all that black, all that darkness except for the stars, and yet that's filled, at least in our area, with sunlight. And that's because the light in those places has nothing to reflect off of. Now, I don't know again about you, but that just blew my mind. If you've never, maybe everybody knew this. Maybe everybody knows this. As I said, I read that, and I was astonished. And I remember I called up a physicist, friend of mine, who teaches at Loma Linda University. I don't have any friends at La Sierra. But Ben Clausen at Loma Linda University, he's a friend of mine, he's a physicist. And I remember I called him up because I just wanted to make sure that this was true. And I called him up and said, Ben, is it true that light in and of itself is invisible and it's dark and you can't see it unless you reflect off of something? And he assured me that it was. And I just thought that was incredible. Light is invisible unless it's reflected off of something. And for a long time I was trying to process this. I was sure that there's got to be some kind of spiritual lesson from this. Something that, if nothing else, and I've talked about this already, it just shows us how our senses, how deceptive our senses can be. Because again, you've always got the idea that, well, that light is light. I mean, it's color. I mean, you see it all the time. Anywhere you look, you see light. I mean, this room is filled with light, and I'm seeing light everywhere. I mean, everybody knows light isn't invisible. Darkness is the absence of light. When it's dark, it means there's no light at all. And when there's light, it's not dark, and you can see and all that and so on. And then yet, if you really do think about it, I think the clearest example is just think of those shots on the moon. Think of this, what it looks like, the horizon and the sky over the moon and the sky over the earth at any time. And just a few thoughts that I thought about this, and I drew a few, I think, some spiritual lessons. Some spiritual lessons. I am talking about spirituality in the age of reason, and there was just some thoughts, some spiritual thoughts that I'd like to share about this. Just some of the ideas, because light is an image that's used popularly in the Bible. And again, I just was overwhelmed with this thought. And I think the first thought right off the bat is what I've talked about. It's just how limited, not just even limited our senses are, but just how deceptive our senses can be. And I know I gave a talk the other day. The whole talk was on just the limits of our senses. But here, light, as I said, we think that light is, and it's dark. It's invisible. You think about it for a minute too. We take for granted the movement of the earth. But you imagine 500 years ago, 600 years ago, and someone saying, that the earth moves. The earth is moving. I mean, look, I'm going to prove to you right now. See, people don't realize how difficult of a job Copernicus had. Copernicus had a real hard time, and there was an awful lot of evidence against Copernicus' theory that, the earth, or in Galileo, that the earth was moving. I mean, I'm going to prove to you, I'm going to give you empirical evidence right now, evidence in front of your eyes that the earth can't be moving. First of all, do any of you feel it move? I mean, are our senses totally deceptive? I mean, do you feel the earth moving? Okay, you don't feel it, but I'm going to prove to you right now the earth isn't moving. All right, maybe we'll try it this way. If the earth was moving, what should have happened? That shouldn't have landed here. If the earth was moving this way, that should have gone whoop over my head. Or if it was spinning this way, I throw it up. Well, I got to be careful how I throw it, yeah. But if I threw it straight up, boom, should have gone one way or another if the earth was moving. Now, this might seem silly to us today, but back then it was, what about birds flying? If the birds were flying, they should have been pulled one way or another. And again, it doesn't look like the earth moves. And there was another thing too called the parallax, where if the earth was moving, the stars should appear at different times of the year. They'd look up and they'd see a star, and the star should have been somewhere radically different later on, and yet it had appeared in the same place. And they said, well, if the earth was really moving, it would have looked differently. As it was, it turned out it really was, but the stars were so far away that they couldn't tell the difference. Nobody really had any idea just how far away they were. The point is, there was a lot of very, very powerful evidence against the earth moving, and our senses don't seem to make that sound correct. And so it shows. I remember somebody once said to a philosopher, Wittgenstein, he talked about how stupid those ancients were for looking up in the sky and seeing the sun move across the sky like that and think the sun was moving. And he said, well, what would it look like if the sun really were moving? And if you think about it, it would look exactly the way it does look to us, like the sun is moving, not us. So the point is, again, and I talked about the other day too, about how our senses say this is solid, it's really mostly empty space. Said too, think about all the radio waves and the cell phone calls and the TV programs all in the air right around us, and yet our senses pick none of it up. So the point is, I think the first lesson I learned from that is, again, it's just another example of how there's a reality greater than what our senses tell us. And I think one of the basic things of a spiritual life and a spiritual reality is the realization that there is a reality out there greater than what appears to our eyes and our ears and our senses, because we know there's something greater out there. And I think being a spiritual person, having a sense of this, is one of the first things, is realizing that there is so much more out there than meets the eye. And in fact, what meets the eye can really be quite deceiving. And I think of another text. I think of a text, famous text, God is light. 1 John 1:5. Now, if God is light, and also 1 John 4:8 says God is love. So God is light and God is love. Now it's interesting too, these texts, particularly this text, God is love. God is light and God is love. Now how can you put these together? Well, I think this fact about light and this concept of love helps us understand something better about the nature of the deity itself. And I don't want to get into the Trinity and this stuff. I don't, theologians and philosophers have been arguing over this for a long, long time, and I accept it on faith. I accept the deity of Christ and the deity of the Holy Spirit. I think that's of course, the deity of the deity, obviously. So I don't want to get in a debate about that, but if you think about it for a minute, This idea that light is darkness unless it reflects off of something. And maybe love, like light, needs to reflect off of something in order to be made manifest. Think about that for a minute. The concept of love alone. What does the concept of love purely as a subject, if I'm using subject-object distinction here, what does love in and of itself mean without an object to receive that love? Does that capiche? Does that make sense? Can you see the point there? Just love freestanding alone. Let's say there was no life in the universe. There was only God. Okay, and there was no life at all anywhere else in the universe. There was just God alone. And it said God is love. Do you see a problem there? Does that, it seems problematic. It almost seems nonsensical. It's like to say, I love, but who? What? Whenever you use the word love, don't you generally use it as a subject, but there's an object as a result of it. There's an object on the other end of it. You don't just love in a vacuum. You don't just, I love, and you stare at a vacuum or nothingness. Of course, physics now tells us that vacuums really aren't nothing. They're filled with energy and all sorts of subatomic stuff going on. But even if you could conceive of a pure vacuum, as we popularly think of a vacuum, you love a vacuum? I mean, can you see the point here? Just the concept of love. But we believe there was a time when the universe didn't exist, when there wasn't anything. There wasn't anything, at least the universe as we know it. Did God not start loving until he created something to love? Now that could be a problem until you understand, and again, I rarely ever talk about the Trinity, because I don't really like wading in waters that are way, way above my head. I mean, I generally try to talk about something I have a vague understanding of. And you talk about taking something on faith, but actually this concept of God as love really has helped me to make more sense of the concept of a triune God. Okay? Because love alone, and again, I realize this is very metaphysical, this is very theological. I mean, this is certain areas that I generally don't like to wade into. But I think this point is simple enough, but the point maybe is, however much it's hard to grasp this, but love alone makes no sense. It needs an object to love. And so even before the creation, as we understand the creation, the universe, though as I said the other day, they're now speculating that the visible universe that we see is really only 7% of what's out there. The rest they're talking about dark matter and dark energy and, who knows. That's an interesting thought about it, dark. Well, I don't want to speculate on where I don't know. But anyway, the point was, if love needs an object to love, then even before creations, this love was reflected in the Trinity, or however you want to use it, between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And you remember Jesus' prayer in John before the cross, and he says, Father, I remember the exact verse where you've loved me with this love even before the beginning of the world. I mean, if you believe in the deity of Christ, if you believe in the eternal existence of Christ, which I do, then you've got Jesus talking about the love between him and the Father even before the world began. And as I said, this whole idea of love, like light, it needs to be reflected off of something in order to be made manifest, in order to be seen. Then suddenly the whole idea of the Trinity makes more sense to me, at least in terms of how God could be a God of love. This love existed for eternity. How could God be love if before he created whatever was made, Scripture says Jesus made that whatever was made by Jesus. And if it was made, if something was made, what does that imply about it? At some point it didn't exist. Okay? If something was made, there was a point when it hadn't been made yet. So even before the world began, God's love existed. And suddenly the Trinity makes a whole lot more sense. As much as you could grasp that, because then there was love within the Godhead itself. But let's bring it down to a simpler level, to where we are today. What does it mean to say that someone is a loving person unless that person has someone or something to love? Love, like light, needs to be directed towards someone or maybe something in order to be made manifest. Again, just to love something, there needs to be an object to it. Until then, I mean, just try to think of the concept of just love itself not loving anything. I don't know about you, but that's just, I don't know, maybe you can grasp that, but just love existing as in and of itself without being poured out upon something, without there being something that to put it on, to receive it, doesn't make much sense. Or maybe another way, perhaps darkness isn't necessarily the absence of light, but the absence of something to reflect light. It's another way to think about that. You know, darkness isn't necessarily the absence of light, but the absence of something to reflect it. And again, this is, maybe you could take these in your own direction, but it says to me that this whole idea of love in and of itself there's got to be a subject and an object of it. Love just can't exist in and of itself. And it makes me think of these verses. Or perhaps the idea of light that is not reflected is light not seen. Explains these words. He who says he is in the light and hates his brother is in darkness until now. He who loves his brother abides in the light, and there is no cause for stumbling in him. But he who hates his brother is in darkness and walks in darkness. And he does not know where he is going because the darkness has blinded his eyes. This is 1 John 2, 9 through 11. And I think here, look how love and light are so closely related in these texts. You know, he who says he's in the light and hates his brother, but he, is in darkness. Where he who loves abides in the light. Love and light, and he does not know where he who walks in darkness, because the darkness has blinded his eyes. And again, we can talk about love, about what it means to love. But unless we pour that love out on others, on something else, it's empty gesturing. Again, how can love with no object to love be love? Like light, only when it's reflected off of something, when it's put on something, does it become seen. Only when love has an object to receive that love does it become manifest. And it's the same with light. Unless light has an object to reflect off of, it is darkness. How interesting, the absence of light itself, or the absence of something lit by light, result in the same thing, darkness. So you could have you could have all the light in the world, but if it doesn't reflect off of something, you have the same thing as if you have no light at all. It's the same as darkness. I remember a while back, I live in the Washington, D.C. area. And there was a story that made the front page of the local metro section. I don't remember what it's called. I don't get the newspaper anymore. It's part of the digital age now. It took me. We got that Washington Post for 27 years. And it was awfully hard for me to stop getting the morning newspaper. Now it doesn't matter to me at all. But I remember there was a story about these people were having a party. It was a hot summer day in D.C. They were having an outdoor barbecue. A couple of families, probably what you do here in Australia on a hot day. And suddenly this guy appears with a gun. He appears with a gun, and he's puts the gun to one of the kids' head, and he's going to rob them. And everybody's in a panic. And as I said, it's a very hot day, and he's got the gun on him. Then at one point, one of the women asks him, "Do you want something to drink?" He's got a gun on him. "You want something to drink?" And he goes, "Okay." And she gives him something to drink. And then she says, "You want some more?" And it was probably, I don't think it was anything alcoholic. I don't think the last thing they probably want to do is give a guy with a gun alcohol. Well, no, it could have been Coca-Cola or something. And she says, "You want a little more?" And he's drinking. And then she says, "Would you like a little food?" And he goes, "Okay." And she gives him some food. And says, "You like a little more?" And she gives him a little more. And this goes on. And then at one point, the guy puts his gun down. And he's eating with them. And then finally, at one point, he says, I'm sorry, I've come to the wrong place. But then, before he leaves, he asks one of the women, can you give me a hug? And then she gives him a hug, and he asks the others there, can you give me a hug? And they went, and these people, the men, the women, whatever, and they gave this guy a hug. And he left. And he left. And I don't know, I just found that story very, very moving. Very, very powerful. As I said, it made the front page of a whole section in the Washington Post. I don't know whatever happened, whether they ever caught the guy or not. But that story, it just said something to me. It said something to me about humanity. It said something to me about the power of love. And we're talking about love here. We're talking about light. Light is energy. Energy is power. Love is power. It's the power to change hearts. It's a power that all the military and police could never do. And I think in that, when I hear a story like that, you look at the title here, Spirituality in the Age of Reason. In many ways, I think the whole concept of human spirituality, of humans having the side, is very, very reasonable. It's a reasonable thing to think about. It's a reasonable aspect of humanity. Again, I keep coming back, and Dennis is going to kill me, this book that I've been reading. And I don't know why I'm plugging this book by a guy who I absolutely disagree with everything, but The Atheist Guide to Reality. If we were just what this guy said, if we were what Darwinian evolution says that we are, where in the world did we get the capacity to love, or to want love, or to give love? Where did we get just this whole spiritual side of us, in many ways, I think fundamentally, our whole concept of spirituality, I think, is being aware. Without being able to understand it, being able to put your finger on it, it's an awareness that there's so much more than what used to you. There's so much more to each one of us than what we see when we stare in the mirror in the morning, than what we feel when our bodies are starting to 56. But I got a good friend of mine. He's an Australian at the GC. He's bald as a cue ball. Lincoln Steed is his name. Lincoln. And every now and then I love to walk into his office and I bend over and said, eat your heart out, Lincoln, eat your heart out. But now I'm starting to lose it up here a little as well. But the point is, there's a sense that we have, and I don't think it's just wishful thinking, that we're more than just flesh and bones, that we're more than just our brains, we're more than just chemicals. Purely, if you look at us on a purely physical level, what are our thoughts? On a purely physical level, you got these cells in your head, these neurons, and there's jillions of these neurons, and they got all these connections. And you reach, I used to know all this stuff well, a certain threshold, and there's a little electrical firing. And like an electrical current goes in this cell, and it fires chemicals. It fires chemicals from one cell, quanta of these neurotransmitters, and they reach another cell. And they cause that cell to fire. And that causes another, and these chemicals. And as far as we know, that's all that goes on. That's the basic level. That's what's going on. And that's fine. But how in the world is an electric current shooting chemicals across a tiny little cleft, a synaptic cleft, causing another cell to fire these chemicals? I remember I asked a brain physiologist one time. I said, okay, you got all these chemicals firing across cells. And that's what thoughts are. I mean, they can narrow it down and all that. I said, how does that create consciousness? Much less the concept, First I just asked him plain old consciousness. He says, we don't have a clue. We don't have a clue. In fact, the other day, a while back, I got a book on here called The Waning of Materialism, and it was a group of essays by psychologists and scientists, The Waning of Materialism. And basically what they're saying is all the scientific research, everything they're doing now, more and more, they don't believe that purely physical things alone, purely what they see with the brain scans and these chemicals firing across, they don't believe that can explain human consciousness. Hence the title of the book, The Waning of Materialism. And then I think ultimately this concept of spirituality, and different people define it different ways, is very reasonable because it's our acknowledging, even if we can't prove it, even if we can't explain it, it's just our way of, it's a human response to realizing that, hey, I know there's more to me than just this flesh and bones, which is slowly but surely just fading away and evaporating and going to dwindle. And I think to deny that, to write that off, and as I said in this book that I read, and I've already written, I have a monthly column in a magazine, and I've already written the column. I wrote the column while I was here about the book. And when I go home, I have a program on the Hope channel. Maybe some of you have seen it, I don't know. But I already know that the next talk I'm going to give on the Hope channel is going to be on that book. And then I've already planned that I'm going to take that and turn that into a sermon, into a talk. So obviously it's affected me. But as I said, I might have mentioned before, his answer for our spiritual problems is just take drugs. Just take drugs, because he says all your brain is, all you are is purely physical. And if it's and the reason, if you're depressed about the meaninglessness of life, you're not, he says all it is because that depression is just a certain wiring in your brain. That's all it is. And if you want to solve that problem, just fix the wiring and chemicals in your brain. And he says, take drugs. He's talking about the pharmaceuticals, Prozac, Paxil, I don't know what they call it down here. But I don't think for most people, I don't imagine most people are going to be satisfied with that answer. Because I don't think most people just think that that's all that we are. And yet in an atheistic evolutionary worldview, what else could we possibly be? And I think too, the reasonableness of spirituality comes from, it's the sense of knowing that there's a gap between something that's finite, which is yourself. I mean, who here isn't aware of their own finitude? And yet the sense that there's also something infinite. And there's a gap there. There's a gap there in the same way who isn't aware of their own temporality in contrast to the whole idea of something eternal. I mean, we can conceive of eternity. We can conceive of transcendence. We can conceive of this. And yet we're so aware of how finite we are, how temporal we are. And yet there's this concept of infinity. There's this concept of eternity. And somehow we're trapped. We're trapped. And I believe human spirituality is logical. It's of course, just because the fact that we're aware of it doesn't mean that we could ever be part of it, but it's not an unreasonable desire anyway. And so there's a gap that, spirituality, I believe, is attempting to, trying to fill this gap. And again, I just find it hard to understand from a purely secular standpoint, or if we were purely just chemicals and molecules, how do we even get these concepts? You could take jillions of carbon atoms and rearrange them all you want, and how are you going to get consciousness and the concept of love and these ideas? So I think it's knowing that there's a gap and trying to fill these gaps. It's seeking to live in an awareness of a reality beyond the immediate reality, which I've talked about numerous times. And I believe spirituality is living with a hope. It's a hope that transcends whatever hope this world in and of itself offers. And I'm sorry. What hope in and of itself does this world offer? What hope does this world offer in and of itself? You can live a great, wonderful life, and then boom, sooner or later it's going to be gone. And yet we've got the awareness of something beyond. I think spirituality too is just living with the hope. I think one of the things that really irks people is the lack of justice. And I think that there's this idea of living with the hope that maybe, it was a philosopher named Immanuel Kant who said with just one premise, and admit it's a pretty big premise. I mean, it's a pretty big leap. But he said with just one premise, and that premise is God is just. He says you have to believe in an afterlife. Why would you think that? With just one, I admit, it's not something that's absolute obvious to anyone, that God is just. It's not obvious to everyone that there's a God. I guess I wouldn't even, we would be out of business if it was. And secondly, that this God is just. But the point is, he said, if God is just, then there has to be an afterlife. Some sort or another, because we sure don't see the justice here. Sure don't think about it. I think there's something to it. Spirituality is a belief in the hope in justice, is a hope in answers to what is really unanswerable. For us now, there are so many unanswered questions. And how many of you, as you've aged and have gotten wisdom. I hate getting older. I mean, I gripe and moan about it. I can't stand it. The only advantage I find is I do get a little more wisdom. I have learned a few more things, but let me tell you, I've got more questions now. I've come nowhere close to getting all the questions answered for me. And I think if I lived 1,000 years, I'd have, for every question I got answered, I'd have a whole lot more unanswered. But it's living with the hope and the promise of something beyond. And this morning I had breakfast, and I was just looking at a piece of fruit. Oh, I remember now. Man, it was good. It was a kiwi, and I didn't have a knife. So I just pulled the skin back, made a little hole, and stuck a spoon in. And was just gouging out the kiwi around the skin. And a lot of times at home, I just eat the skin as well. I just eat the skin as well. I find it fine. My wife thinks it's disgusting, but I can eat an apple, and I'll eat the core and everything. Hey, it's good fiber. Helps you, helps. Please. But, I looked at the taste of that fruit, and I know this sounds hokey. Because I was even thinking about this talk tonight, but nothing would ever get me to believe you could explain that fruit. The taste and the smell and the richness of it and the vitamins and all that. Nothing is going to tell me that that's got a purely physical explanation. You know what I'm saying? It just intimated, it hinted to me at something just beyond just what's here. Beyond just what's here. And I think it seemed to be incredibly narrow, incredibly naive, incredibly parochial, just to limit it. Well, it's just atoms in the void. It's natural selection. It's chance. Come on. Come on. And finally, I think ultimately, spirituality. We talked about light and love and the link between it, and I think spirituality is loving on faith. It's living beyond faith. It's not resigning yourself to the dread and doom that our flesh ultimately gives us. That it's just reaching beyond, realizing that reality is greater than what we see here, and it's reaching out in faith. Because that's all you got in the end. There's certain things you just can't prove. It's reaching out in faith, but it's a reasonable faith. It's reaching out and seeking to know. It's reaching out for something beyond just what this world in and of itself offers, because in the end it's so short, it's so finite, and it's so temporal, and really it's all so ultimately unsatisfying. Yeah, I think of Zajonc's box. That's what I call it, Zajonc's box. Filled with light, yet full of darkness. It really humbled me. It really has humbled me. Because again, though, it just shows me how much the world, how beyond our comprehension and beyond our senses, even something simple as light. They say light, for a beam of light, time stops. The faster you move, the slower time goes. And beam of light moving at the speed of light. Ideally, time doesn't even exist for a photon. I don't know how to explain all that. But things like that just help me realize how narrow and how limited human knowledge of itself is. In the end, I think the ultimate message is all the truth, all the light in the world, unless lived out in love, lived out in living others, can become darkness. It's kind of a scary thought to have all the light all around you and yet still live in darkness. And I think the essence of spirituality is really seeking to live in the light. I'd like to end with this verse. But if we walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus Christ, his Son, cleanses us from all sin.